A little bit early here. Good morning. It's nice to see everyone back. Thank you for staying with us night and day. Welcome to the third session of Age Boom. And for those of you who haven't noticed yet, both day one and day two's recordings are posted on our portal. They're in two places, in the on-demand video section, as well as in the agenda section. You'll find a link. So those are there to consult going forward if you either didn't attend or weren't able to make a recording. I don't really want to use up too much of our time together, except for two things. I'd like our fellows to make sure to make a note today that tomorrow we really want you to stay on for just a few minutes to do the same matching process with the interviews you'll have next week, as well as to complete our survey, our evaluation. We've already taken some of your input into account, and I want to encourage you to keep giving us input. It's really very productive for us. So thank you for that. And because I really don't want it to get lost in the shuffle tomorrow as we conclude, I'm just going to ask Nell to spotlight our team. This is my dream team anyway. Jennifer Ware, Nell Conway, and Cynthia Franco, who've been working both on the front end and the back end. I hope you appreciate the incredible and intense effort it is to coordinate what was it, Nell, 100 interviews in over a weekend, essentially, which Nell did. And Jennifer has been with me since the very beginning, just thinking through everything. And I couldn't have done this without her. And Cynthia is a Columbia student who has been working our communications channel. So my thanks to all of them. And I hope that this team will stay intact for next year and we'll be back. So I pass it right over to Julia Yarbo, to whom I'm grateful for all of her background help as well. She helped us bring in some of those guests last night. She's going to moderate our first panel on a topic that we've been speaking about pretty generally up to now. And it's time to look a little more deeply. These are issues of equity, especially when disproportionate stress is borne by people of color and lower socioeconomic status, and how that affects their chances of healthy aging, which is really the crux of this Age Boom Academy. It's the cost to health futures of this informal caregiving economy. So Julia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Caitlin, and good morning, everybody. I am joining you from Northern California, so wherever you're at, good morning or almost good afternoon. I'm Julia Yarbo. I'm really excited to be here, and congratulations to all of you for being part of the Age Boom Academy. Just a quick background so you know who it is that's moderating the panel. I am a 25-year veteran broadcast journalist, so fellow journalists out there, kudos to everybody. I currently serve as a full-time communications consultant with MAGID, but the role that has me involved today is that I was a family caregiver for 20 years to my elderly mother, now deceased, which involved basically turned me into a caregiving advocate and educator, because I experienced firsthand the heavy duty, hands-on efforts of caring for my elderly mother. And I learned that you don't know what you don't know. And if you don't, you're already in the thick of it and it becomes very challenging. So I experienced all of those issues of medical care, finding housing, in-home care, how to pay for it, how to manage my life while caring for mom. Sadly, my mom passed in 2020 at the age of 90. And shortly after that, I began writing and sharing my experiences because, again, I realized that if you wait until you're in the thick of all of this caregiving, it can be overwhelming and it can knock you over. And so I am here today on behalf of my writing efforts, Keeping It Real Caregiving. I invite you to follow my Julia Yarbo Media Group Facebook page, which is an open page. And I have thousands of followers who many are caregivers who share their story. So that's also an avenue for you. So with that, I would like to dive right in and get to our panelists. A lot of great information this morning. So I will do a brief introduction and then we'll dive in. So this morning, we are going to be hearing from Dr. Sharia Robinson Lane, assistant professor with the University of Michigan School of Nursing. We will also be speaking with Dr. Jennifer Olson, the CEO of the Rosalind Carter Institute for Caregivers. And we are joined by Dr. Martin Picard, associate professor and director of the Mitochondrial Psychobiology Group. I wanted to make sure that I said that, with the Columbia University Irving Medical Center. So to guide you through the real life applications of this particular panel, which is titled Questions of Caregiving, Equity, and How Stress Gets Under Our Skin. So let's first talk about that question of equity, and in some cases, the lack of equity that we see across our healthcare system. That's often a component for many caregivers. So Dr. Robinson Lane, let's begin with you. If you could talk to us a little bit about what specifically under the umbrella of equity do we need to understand, and what are the inequities within that?
Sure, and thank you for that question. I think anybody can be a caregiver at any point in time. And one of the things that is most challenging about caregiving work is that we often say that individuals are voluntold into this space, that you just happen to be there at the opportune time, and the occasion arises where you just have to step up. There's often very little training or preparation for this space. And the individuals who become most affected by it are the folks who tend to be the most under-resourced. And so that means individuals who may not have the same sorts of financial means to be able to pay for additional outside assistance or care outside of the home, who may have to or rely upon the finances of the person that they may need to care for. It affects individuals' ability to be able to earn an income for themselves and to take care of daily needs. And they may also find themselves what has been termed as double duty or triple duty caregivers, in which they have a professional job as a nurse, a nursing assistant, or something in the helping professions, and then also find themselves caring for a older adult or a spouse. So a double duty caregiver or a triple duty caregiver, in which they're caring for both a spouse or an older adult in their life, as well as children in the home. And this tends to disproportionately affect not only individuals who are under-resourced, but particularly individuals from racial and ethnic minority groups. When you look at the type of care that's provided, we look at what's called the activities of daily living. So basic skills like taking people to the bathroom, helping them to get dressed, feeding them, these sorts of things, as well as what's often called instrumental activities of daily living.
Well, looks like
Okay, looks like we
Let's
have a
move-
little bit of freeze
Yes.
up. And by just a quick shake of heads, can all of you still hear and see me? I want to make sure that it's not my signal.
yes.
Okay. Okay, so we're still here. So perhaps we can, we'll see if Dr. Robinson Lane pops back in, and perhaps we will move forward, and then we can come back around if that signal pops back in. How does that sound with everybody? So part of the journey here is setting up our speakers in a line that is easy to understand. And so Dr. Robinson Lane was explaining the equity factors and who it impacts and to what level. And our next aspect of that, and so we'll remember, we'll kind of move these puzzle pieces around. When we talk about equity challenges, Dr. Robinson Lane is talking about the physical sides of who it impacts with healthcare services, finances. But then we also have to think about equity challenges in terms of our health. Our next panelist, Dr. Martin Picard, explains how many of those day-to-day hurdles that we were beginning to hear about literally get under our skin. And we're not just talking that you have a bad day and that you feel a little stressed, literally on a physical level, getting under your skin. So Dr. Picard, thank you for joining us. And if you can explain what that truly means for all of us and why we need to care about that.
Yes, thank you. This is really fantastic. I'm glad to be part of this, and such an important question. I think we all have experiences in some way that how we feel and our subjective experiences end up influencing our biology, right? When you you get ready for a presentation of some kind, or you're meeting with someone and you're a little anxious, your hands can get clammy, or your heart speeds up, and those are all very real psychobiological processes, right, that we experience on a daily basis. But when the stressors that we're talking about here, and the chronic stress of inequity and caregiving is chronic, that this is when it can actually get under the skin and have deleterious consequences. So what do we mean by getting under the skin? And I think the reason this is relevant to understand at a biological level is that it has the ability and the possibility of helping us understand why we're either resilient to those challenges and able to take them on and to strive through them, or we're vulnerable and we get crushed by it, and then the organism and the body ends up suffering the consequences of chronic stress. So there are a variety of processes that lie between the mind and the body, right? And as we experience challenges and stressors, our subjective experiences are transformed into hormones, among other things in the body. And those hormones that we know as stress hormones, including cortisol, for example, will go and travel through to every cell of the body, and then act on receptors, and then transduce that inside the cell. So every cell in the body can actually sense those hormones that were produced in response to the brain perceiving stress, right, or perceiving challenges that we feel are hard to overcome. So what happens then? So every cell now feeling the stressor starts to mobilize responses. And I think most people here will have heard about inflammation, and chronic inflammation as a thing that is bad for your health and a risk factor for cardiovascular disease, a risk factor for cancer, and so on. So the way inflammation works is that it's the cells feeling stressors and then in responding to that, the same way that we respond by increasing our heart rate, cells respond by secreting cytokines, pro-inflammatory cytokines. And then voila, there's inflammation in the bloodstream because cells are releasing those things. An important point is that every little bit of the stress response, like the heart racing or getting sweaty hands or producing inflammation, costs energy. And energy is this fundamental thing that is the difference between being alive or being dead. So the fundamental difference between a thinking, feeling, stressed or inspired person and a cadaver, right? A dead body is really the flow of energy. The cells are the same, the organs are the same, the genes are the same, but if you're not moved by energy, then there's no life and there's no responses. So all of those little stressors that trigger heart rate and inflammation cost energy. So the body ends up wasting precious energy in building responses to stress. And that involves a very special organelle inside every cell of your body, which is called the mitochondria. And this is what my research group studies, the intracellular processes by which energy is transformed. And we found, for example, that under chronic stress, the mitochondria actually shift and become altered in their ability to produce energy. So then it becomes relevant in the context of chronic stress to understand what can we do to keep our mitochondria and to keep the energy flowing optimally in the organism so that we can either be resilient or lack thereof. And there are three things that would be useful to highlight. One is we know very well moving, physical activity, or just walking instead of taking a car, and these kind of things, going up the stairs instead of the elevator, has a stimulatory role. It enhances the mitochondria and the organism. Not eating too much is the second thing we know is very good for your mitochondria, and probably is a third thing is doing the things that inspire us. So taking the time to do the things that we resonate with and that we feel bring us energy. We don't quite know how this works, but likely if we feel something is bringing us energy, it's kind of on a long-term span, it's likely having a biological effect. So in terms of caregiving and underserved or underprivileged minorities that Dr. Robinson Lane was talking about, when there's no support to drives the demand, the energetic demand on the mind and the body, and without the resources to support our biology, then this can end up driving the risk of disease. So there are two things we can think about. One is think about how we can provide external resources to avoid disproportionate and unequal access to resources. And then the second is to understand the factors, the biological factors that I'm talking about with energy that can bolster and enhance our psychobiology to allow us to build resilience to those challenges.
And Dr. Pickard, let me ask you this as well, and we'll transition back over to Dr. Robinson-Lane, and your point of feeling those physical aspects in our bodies, but then how it relates to a population who may already be feeling stressors or underserved or having lack of resources, which does tie directly to those inequities. So if we could kind of loop back around, Dr. Robinson-Lane, as we listen to that information of the physical challenges in our body, what does that mean short-term, long-term for a population that is already facing challenges, and now we have this overlaid? Can you speak to that?
Sure. Part of it is that there's this increased risk of both cardiovascular or issues with individuals' heart in the population where they're already having higher incidence of hypertension and obesity and other health problems that are related to stress. I think one of the things that Martin really emphasizes is this idea that stress can really take a toll on one's health. And it's not just your physical health, but your social, emotional, spiritual, like every aspect of yourself can really be affected by these additional responsibilities. And so it's really critical that in thinking about caregiver support, that personal self-care and particularly health maintenance has to be something that's incorporated and something that individuals don't really think about. In one of my studies where we've examined around 200 family caregivers of persons with dementia, one of the things that we found is that there is a higher incidence of alcohol use amongst caregivers, particularly in the earlier stages of the dementia process. And that's not something that we really talk about often. Do we talk about healthy coping strategies outside of alcohol and in states where now marijuana is available, marijuana use, where individuals may rely upon these readily accessible coping strategies that may not be the most healthiest ways of dealing with and addressing stress.
There we go. I'm unmuting myself. And just listening to you mention that and the connection between the physical side and the emotional, mental side, before we bring in Dr. Olson, I want to ask both of you in relation to how this is connected. What would be, from each of your perspectives, what would be a story that our journalists could then tap into that touches on the cellular aspect of this and also on the emotional mental health aspect of this? So Dr. Pickard, if you could share with us an idea that our journalists could take this and say, all right, this is the story I'm going to do.
Right. So maybe I'll pitch two. One of them, is about why energy is key to health. And maybe that's something that people haven't, thought about so much, but we hear a lot about, sustainable energy and kind of energy in the world, right? But there's the same kind of process happen in the organism. There's a finite amount of energy. When there's not enough, it causes crisis. You get, the gas prices going up and all sorts of other things. And same thing in the body. It's just that when their energy runs out and the organism, we can feel that as fatigue, but then more deep down in your cells will feel that as accelerated aging, for example, and an accumulation of damage. So why energy is the key to health, could be something that'd be interesting. And there's a lot of kind of parallel lines that could be brought into to, I think, bring, the public into understanding this fundamental reality of the body. And then a second one maybe that would be fun to debunk is that why genes don't dictate health and why stress shapes health. And I think that's common in the public is this idea that you have the bad genes for this or the good genes for that. And there are some rare, diseases that are caused by genes, and that we know about those. But the majority of the non-communicable, chronic diseases that actually affect Americans and from which people suffer from are not genetic in origin. And there's a risk that can be inherited in some way, but the vast majority, probably 90% of disease risk is shaped by the things we experience, which includes health, stress, and which includes the behaviors we engage in, which those things are intertwined because when you run out of resources, internal energetic resources or external, financial family support resources, then it shapes how we behave and so on. So why genes don't dictate health and stress does.
Two great story ideas. Thank you. I'm taking notes myself. And Dr. Robinson Lane, two quick story ideas, some pitches, and then the reporters can connect with you afterwards.
Sure. I think one place is really thinking about the support that individuals have available. We have a paper that's coming out next week about family caregiving around COVID patients who've been hospitalized in the ICU. About 20% of persons with COVID end up in the ICU, and families end up having to take care of them. And so thinking about the resources that are available and how do people connect with the right resources, how do communities prepare for aging in place, and to support families as individuals grow older or face disability can also be interesting, particularly across states, because the resources available through insurance, and particularly Medicare and Medicaid specifically, can vary significantly and change how caregivers are supported financially and able to care for individuals at home.
Great ideas. And having lived it, I can vouch for that whole idea of aging in place definitely becomes a challenge for families. And so as we continue on, as we wrap up our first portion of the program, I want to bring in Dr. Jennifer Olson, again, the CEO of the Rosalind Carter Institute for Caregivers, which really sort of puts a final touch on these topics that we've been talking about, that, the issues of equity/inequity within certain populations, what that does to our bodies and our minds on a physical level. And then the question of, okay, well, how do we make sure that our families and individuals are getting the care they need and that support that we hear so much about? So Dr. Olson, if you could share with us a little bit of, how we connect the dots on that. How do we create that safety net, taking these issues into account? And be sure, okay, yeah, there we go.
Well, I think first I'd like to just kind of bring us to think about our current approach to caregiver supports, which is tied to often the diagnosis of another individual. And so when you think about the work Dr. Robinson Lane is describing, somebody coming out of an ICU may not have they might have many diagnoses, or they could have a broad set of concerns, but if those diagnoses don't match what the state or government programs are that are related to caregiver support, that caregiver is unable to achieve or go after any sort of, whether that's financial resources, coaching, training, support in the home. And that exists across the board for many of the caregiver programs that are operating both out of government agencies and out of nonprofit entities, community organizations, and academic institutions. Caregiving is potentially the only place besides maternal and child health where you would say that the diagnosis of another person is what defines the treatment that the caregiver gets. And that construct has really created challenges. I think the idea of what do I need as a caregiver may have to do with where I am, my own health, how stressed my cells are, what my access to, food, housing, et cetera, are in such a different way. That diagnosis may or may not be the key thing that is key for my support as a caregiver. And I think that has kind of created these caregiver verticals in a competitive way almost, or just kind of a specific way, as if you're a dementia caregiver, then this is your formula of supports and services. And it fails to realize that for many people, especially a low socioeconomic status or those who are struggling with the challenges of our healthcare system, a diagnosis may not be obtainable, or it may take years because of access, affordability, and some of the other challenges we have in place. And if we don't kind of recognize that, we're not going to actually be able to support caregivers on the scale to which we need to do. And I also think like we have to kind of recognize that the caregiver status in and of itself, like in some ways could be seen as, based on what we've just described, right? It's already a disparity and it creates disparities in its own right, for all of the top things we talked about. So like, how do we grapple with that and not think of like caregiver issues in a box by themselves and then further define caregivers and their supports by that condition?
I have to admit, I have not thought about what you said. The diagnosis of another person defines the support that a caregiver gets, which is so crucial. And I'll just, to pitch into the question of what would be story ideas for people. Right now, I'm dealing with a neighbor who just had an adult son released from the hospital with a medical condition. And so they have to figure out how they're going to get care for their adult son, but it doesn't fall into many of the other categories. So this is such a crucial point. So within that realm, what would be 2 stories that our reporters could hit the ground running with right now? And again, I'm feverishly taking my own notes because these are such great topics.
I think there are many caregivers who are blocked from receiving services and supports because they don't have that diagnosis on a piece of paper, and they know that their person that they're caring for needs support and that it is burdening and challenging them, but doors get closed pretty effectively. And I think the second storyline that doesn't get talked about very much is we talk about health literacy, but insurance and payment literacy. Caregivers struggle often with the challenges of, as Dr. Robinson said, like, right, the Medicare, Medicaid, when do I get what benefit? What order am I supposed to put these in? And we spend a lot of time implying that that's tied to health literacy. That's really insurance literacy, and like finance, complicated finance, which changes every fiscal year or every time a job changes, like all those complexities. And that in and of itself, figuring out ways to support caregivers with that would unlock so many of the other stressors that are coming into play. And like, that is not exactly a glamorous thing. That's not as enjoyable as maybe teaching, some courses on friendly caregiver strategy and de-stress strategy. Not to speak lightly of those, but that is I'll call it maybe mundane is the critical, I think, to a lot of the challenges, especially around finance.
We have 3 minutes left in our first portion before we open it up for questions. So I'll call this our lightning round question for all 3 of you. Given that statement that, especially on the insurance, payment, financial side, not a fun topic, kind of mundane, but so crucial to people. One quick thought of how do we help people understand that they need to pay attention to this? And I'm looking at my box. So Dr. Olson, let's start with you.
Health insurance education in school, because everyone will become a caregiver at some point, or need a caregiver, or need to figure this out. So don't wait till you're a caregiver to try and start that education process.
Okay, Dr. Picard.
I think I'll defer to my colleagues on this one. They're better qualified than I am to answer that.
Well, I think when we talk about health literacy, sometimes there's this idea we only tend to focus on like what people know about stuff, right? Whether it's what they know about health and what they know about insurance or what they know about policy, so how do you think about your elected officials and the sorts of issues that they bring forward, to think about how care is paid for, how you can use your benefits to like make your home adaptable to be able to get a wheelchair through the door or to get your bathroom modified so that someone can use it, and what resources you have available. So there's policy implications. But what also is important that gets missed a lot is just literacy. Can people understand the material that's in front of them? And that's a real gap in, I think, a lot of the work that's out there that often gets missed, particularly when you think about the individuals that end up working in these spaces and that need to understand what's available to them.
Thank you so much for that. Look at that. That's my alarm going off. We are right on time. We're doing great, group. I love it. So this is the portion where we are going to open it up to questions for all of you. We see a lot of hands going up, so I'm going to go down the list that I see in here. And the first one that we saw come in was from Gail Marks Jarvis. So we'll start there. And be sure to unmute.
Okay, are you hearing me? Okay, very interesting discussion. I have to tell you, I've been listening to this discussion about the resources people need and financial literacy they need, and the insurance literacy they need. I couldn't agree more. I've been a personal finance columnist for 3 decades. And I have to tell you that when I needed to maneuver through this system myself for my mother, despite being very literate in investing, insurance, whatnot, I had a situation that I didn't understand, and I didn't know what resources to go to. So my question for you, the panel, is instead of just saying that people need this, is there a one-stop shopping? Where can people go, for example, to learn how to maneuver through an insurance issue, or how to read a long-term care insurance policy, or how to find the right home care? Can any of you provide like a link to a one-stop shopping?
Well, unfortunately, that's a wish that I think everybody would like, is a one-stop shop. There isn't one place that you can go, but there's lots of different sorts of places that provide a lot of different information. And so one of the places for insurance would be to call the, if it's private insurance or supplementary insurance, to call directly to the insurance provider, who can provide information about the resources that are available and can help to navigate benefits. Specific consumer organizations like the Alzheimer's Association for individuals that have dementia provide a ton of resources in terms of both caregiver support, understanding what resources are available in the local community can be helpful. Your local senior center is something that often goes unnoticed, that has lots of local area resources. And for older adults, the Area Agency on Aging is perhaps the closest to one-stop shopping that you might be able to get, that they can direct you to what resources are available, as well as March of Dimes. I'm sorry, there's another large organization that's similar that can also provide a lot of support. But the Area Agency on Aging, a lot of folks don't know that they also do a lot of work with disability services. And so they often can provide information about disability services in the area as well.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Our next hand up was Nina Keck.
Hi, my question was kind of similar. I was really glad that it was asked. And I'm wondering, Dr. Olson, has the Carter Center or your work there tried to craft more of a general guideline? I had a woman who lives close to me in Vermont who is taking care of a friend with dementia. She's a nurse, her husband's an internal medicine physician. They're both super medically literate. And they just talked about, we really would like a guide, but I didn't know if you know of any organizations that are trying to make one.
I mean, I think the resources that Dr. Robinson Lane just went through are all like different spaces where that is. But one thing that we have been talking about is right now there isn't like a ombudsman for like caregiver insurance related issues. Why doesn't that, why isn't there more of an infrastructure? Because caregivers are dealing with issues with their employer, their benefits, someone else's benefits, like things. It is not as kind of clear cut as some of the other kind of issue areas. And where would you even go to say, like, this doesn't seem to be working right? Who do I start with? And that's also speaks to a policy priority we see, which is there needs to be an Office of Caregiver Health, because where else do we have 53 million people that don't have a champion and a voice in our federal machinery?
And we had a question from Bill Cole.
Yeah, so I'm really struck by the racial inequities just in aging in general. And of course, these would touch caregivers as well, caregivers of color. The life expectancy, the average life expectancy for Black Americans in 2021 was 70.8 years. And for white Americans, 76.5 years. It's like almost a 6-year difference. And I'm just wondering, what, to the panelists in general, how do we close that incredibly unjust gap?
Again, that's the challenge. I mean, and that the gap is even slightly larger between when you look at men specifically there, and COVID has actually decreased that life or widened that gap by about another year. And so it's not getting better, it's getting worse. So I think part of it is being more thoughtful about health disparities and remembering that health disparities are preventable differences in outcomes and access to healthcare, health diagnosis, and in resources, and being more intentional about addressing bias in the provision of resources, and specifically at the structural level within institutions and organizations, meaning thinking about how are there differences in policies around what resources are available depending upon the community that you live in. For older adults in particular, most older adults live in lower density populations. So they're not in the city where most of the resources are available. They're living on the outskirts of town and in rural areas. So then how do you make sure that you get support out to these individuals? And then you layer that with the income that folks might have that can maybe close some of these gaps. So I think that it's a multi-tiered issue that really has to be not addressed from an interpersonal or specific organizational perspective, but being more thoughtful about the organization's processes and policies that influence access to care and the support that individuals need.
We have another question from Sarah Harrison. And also I should mention, we hope that your questions are being answered, to your satisfaction. If not, go ahead and drop, a follow-up into the chat as well, so that we have that in the record.
Yeah, hi. This question is directly for Dr. Olson, but I think it touches on issues that everyone's spoken about. So I've heard about mitochondrial drugs or interventions, mostly from communities that are interested in transhumanism or like extending aging. I'm thinking about people like Aubrey de Grey. And so I'm wondering how we take interventions like that and refocus them on communities that are like already disproportionately impacted, rather than sort of focusing them towards communities that are looking to extend life just for like the sake of avoiding death.
I'm going to defer to Martin on that one.
Okay. It's a good question. It's true. A lot of the public interest in that area of boosting mitochondria and energy has come from the segment of the population who want to biohack or kind of improve and enhance their performance or their lifespan. The core idea is I think, the same. And maybe those people have more free time, more resources, to think about living really long lives, as opposed to, just making they're not struggling as much with daily challenges. So maybe that kind of drives the focus of interest for that. But the core idea is really the same. If you can enhance how much energy your organism has access to, in effect, you're increasing the resources that the body has to deal with stress and adversity. In the long term, this likely will contribute to prevent disease and increase lifespan. In the short term, it might help to face some of the challenges. So I think you're right. This kind of conversation I haven't seen happen in this context of caregiving stress or under-resourced communities, but there's no reason that shouldn't.
Okay, we also had a question from Joe Hasselhoff. Are you still with us?
Yes, actually, you were kind enough to already answer that, so I'll just pass. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. Okay, our next question was coming, or the hand raised was from Ronnie Loveler.
Ronnie, please unmute yourself.
Okay, am I unmuted now?
Yep.
Perfect.
I would like Dr. Olson, or really anybody, I'd like some harder numbers. I'm hearing the 53 million people are without, who need something, but I'd like to get more of a handle. Is it 53 million people needing caregiving? Is it 53 million needing caregiving plus their caregivers? Who are the 53 million people? And I'd like to segue, if possible, with some clarification on the numbers, is really where are our caregivers coming from? We've talked a lot about them coming from immigrant communities, and there's probably more of a tradition in immigrant communities to take care of your elders. But what can we do to broaden the horizons for the immigrant caregivers?
I think there's a few resources, and I see putting them in the chat, the work that AARP has done with National Alliance for Caregiving. I think you had Jason on earlier. He's probably in a previous session, he talked about their work, which said 53 million family caregivers pre-COVID. So we all can recognize that that number has likely changed. That isn't equally distributed across different population groups or income groups by any stretch. Diverse Elders Coalition has done some work breaking down kind of what those experiences are and looking at the variation in stress level. Some work that they did, I think a few months ago, spoke about that diverse caregivers take on additional tasks, whether that's tied to interpretation and translation, or also navigating an immigration system while dealing with the healthcare system. And therefore they display higher levels of strain on their own health, work, and relationships. And so I think there is that granular info, and yeah, we'll put some of those sources in. But I also think there are some barriers to the use of the term and how we even find out to get to that number of 53 million. I'd suggest that we should be asking, if you're caring for someone, when we ask somebody if they smoke, if they drink, or if they sit at their desk all day, because it's an equal driver, and that would give us much more insight on the health effects on caregivers.
Thank you.
Okay, we also had a question from, I'm scrolling back through my messages here. So Petty Greco, and I hope I said that correct.
Yes, thank you. Sorry about that. Somebody just came in. No, we were talking about insurance literacy, things like that. I'm thinking about caregiver literacy among doctors. And obviously doctors are very overworked, they're burned out and whatnot, but I'm wondering if that's an avenue where we can kind of find some solutions, caregiver literacy among doctors, especially since Dr. Olson, as you mentioned, the diagnosis is the point at which caregivers actually can get kind of a marching orders for what they need to be doing.
So I'd push and say, I actually think that the front line for caregiver identification can happen more in a community setting that isn't clinical. So like the pharmacy tech, because picking up a prescription is one of the first things somebody does when they start their journey, and that's not quite defined yet. So where are there other places? I think Dr. Robinson Lane probably has some other work that shows where there are other community touch points, so that we're connecting and making the case that like caregiving is a community and family experience, and it happens progressively, and there's earlier points of intervention.
Thank you.
And just to share with all of the journalists, to piggyback off of Dr. Olson's comment, and again, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a nurse, but I was a hands-on family caregiver for 20 years. And to your point of the doctor's awareness and education, at the last 3 to 4 years of my mother's life, I knew more about the resources in my community than any of the doctors that I was taking her to, because I had to do the work. And they would say, oh, well, just there are resources. And that was pretty much their only answer. And I said, no, there aren't resources. Here's what's in the community. And I had several doctors ask if I was a nurse, because I knew the interactions of my mother's medications and when she needed to take them and what it would do if she didn't have those medications at the right time. And so one of the things that I discovered was that there is a very low level communication amongst caregivers who share information, and it doesn't always reach the level of the policymakers or the doctors. They're zeroed in on their work and they don't truly understand. They say, oh, well, take your medicine and I'll give you this prescription, but they may not really know that you don't have a place to go to within your community. So that's very real. And the other issue is that many caregivers don't necessarily think that they're a caregiver, because it's the person that they love, and they don't identify and think, I'm a caregiver. They don't realize that running the errands, going to get the medications, scheduling the appointments, fixing the food, giving their person a bath or a shower, that's just who they love. So they do it. So they don't think that they're a caregiver. So Ronnie, to your point, those numbers are out there, but people, if you say, are you a caregiver? And they say, no, I'm not a caregiver, because they don't make that connection. So there's always that to think about as well. So I just wanted to piggyback off of that.
And to that end, I think that one of the things that also gets missed is this idea of intergenerational caregiving. So in some of the reports, you see that like children are included as caregivers. So when you think about, like, for example, leaving somebody who's like, let's say 9 or 8, and giving them a task like going and feeding a grandparent, or sitting with a grandparent, or making sure grandma doesn't leave the house, or, you know, some of these small tasks that you could delegate to a little person. There's lots of instances in which we don't really have any training to support young people, and not just children, but even like young adults who may be in this space, or how families often incorporate more of the family and the community into caregiving tasks, but don't provide a lot of the information around exactly what it is that they're doing, or how to best go about some of these tasks.
It's a great point. I'm looking at our time. We have a few minutes left, so we have time for 2 more questions. Liza, you had your hand up, and then we'll wrap up with Gail. So Liza,
Okay.
You're up.
Thank you. I don't know if this is an appropriate question for this panel. I would think maybe Sharia could maybe answer it, but do we have any stats on the number of frontline caregivers who are also family caregivers?
Yeah, there's some work. I don't have the information offhand, but I can't think of her name either for whatever reason, but it's often referred to as double duty and triple duty caregiving. And so there's a couple of papers out about this. If I find the author information, I'll stick it in the chat.
Wonderful, thank you.
Let's see. Gail, you had a follow-up question.
Yeah, it's somewhat related for, but also what other people are talking about. So Dr. Olson, again, I thought this was very interesting that the diagnosis may stand in the way of people getting the kind of help they need. Have you found, or have any of the other panelists found, a way that if the diagnosis is inappropriate, is not appropriate for getting help, is there, or can you provide any tips for how you would perhaps talk to a doctor or go somewhere else to have that diagnosis changed so you do get the support you need?
I have less on tips, but more on a different problem set that might need some journalism work to look into more, which is caregivers of those with long COVID. We know there's so many challenges around the varying experiences and symptom complexes that are showing up there. And caring for someone in that space could be a decades-long journey with variable role caregiver intensity. And so we're also just trying to figure out what that is going to look like, because we don't see caregivers in the long COVID conversation or supporting caregivers in the long COVID conversation.
You also mentioned people have trouble getting diagnosed, which is definitely a long COVID issue. Is there any place people can go to find well-informed doctors who can deal with people with long COVID?
I think Columbia has a clinic, but I won't speak to that.
Yeah, and I know University of Michigan also has a long COVID clinic. So I think that there's more clinics that are coming up, and in the last year, they've changed some of the disability benefits available through the federal government to where now people more qualify for COVID. And one thing that I will put out there still is it's important for when people get a positive COVID test that they go to their doctor and get a test, because if you experience long COVID symptoms and you don't have a test from a doctor that indicates that you have had COVID, you don't have any proof that your symptoms that you're now experiencing, there's no proof that you've had it. So I want to continue to encourage people that if you do get a positive test, go to any doctor and get it verified so that it's something on record that you've had it. So that way you're protected or your loved ones are protected and can get access to benefits if you need them later.
That's a great suggestion.
Thank you for that. Did not know that. And we have time for one final question. I lied before when I said we would wrap. This question is from Nora, so I'll just read the question that you put into the chat, which this is a great question. Wondering if people such as social workers or palliative care teams are helpful with insurance literacy. I know doctors are not, but what about some of those others that hospitals offer for support? Dr. Robinson Lane.
Sorry. Yeah,
there you go.
Your best bet is to contact the insurance. Believe it or not, they're very helpful in helping you to navigate what benefits are available. And they do have Medicare and Medicaid navigators. Sometimes social workers can be helpful. And you can get connected with folks through the Area Agency on Aging that can help to get you connected with people that understand this, or looking at different disability advocacy groups. They can also help to connect you with folks that can understand some of the basics of insurance, but insurance or companies in general, believe it or not, can be helpful in at least helping you to understand what benefits are available. But it's just, they can vary depending upon the insurance that you have and where you live at.
That is great information. Thank you all. Being mindful of our time, and I want to make sure that Caitlin has any final words. Dr. Picard, Dr. Robinson Lane, Dr. Olson, thank you, all of you, for your time this morning, your expertise, your care, your passion for working within this space. We appreciate that. And thank you to all the journalists. I hope that you have some great story ideas and vision for moving forward with this information. And I will take one of those plug type moments to say, if any of you, I was not part of last night's panel of Meet the Caregivers, but again, many years of hands-on care for my mom, doing every one of those ADLs while working full time, trying to figure out how am I going to survive and navigate through this system. So I'm going to put my email into the chat as well. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. I like to think I bridge the rural and urban divide because I live rural. I'm a person of color. I'm a woman. And we have limited medical services and medical resources in the area. So all of those things converged on me. So I have lived it. So I'll put that in the chat. And Caitlin, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, Martin, Sharia. That was fabulous. I want to plug also Martin's very broad interdisciplinary thinking on this, and possibly we didn't make the most of him in the Q&A, but I'm sure Martin is available to talk to you more about how he thinks about how stress gets under the skin. So thank you to you all. And Julia, thank you for just a wonderful job moderating this panel. We have 5-minute break. We'll be back here on the nose at noon to start, noon Eastern. Thank you so much.
All right, everyone. We do have some breakouts that I'm going to open up. My following upcoming panel, I'm going to put you all in a breakout room to quickly say hello. So keep an eye out for that prompt. Fellows, we have 3 rooms for you to join. Please don't join the speaker green room, but feel free to join rooms 1, 2, or 3 if you'd like to quickly say hello and do some networking during our break now. Otherwise, we'll see you back right at the top of the hour at 12 o'clock. Thank you.
All righty. And so it goes. We're going to hit the ground again. I thought the first panel went very well, and we've got an exceptional second panel for you today. I want to welcome Carrie Hannon for this employer's role when workers have to moonlight as informal caregivers. We're really fortunate to have her because she's someone who's been thinking about the workplace and issues of the workplace for most of the journalistic career of hers that I'm aware of. I think the panel is self-explanatory, but I'd just like to say that in lieu of policy solutions, America's reliance on the private sector tends to bring problems to the fore and make employers allies in the quest for policies, but that are not necessarily beneficial to individuals. It depends on, I guess, the labor market, and we'll hear about that. So, keeping in mind that retaining and competing to retain valuable workers in a tight labor market is really where some of this policy and progressive attitudes to support families and caregivers will come in. And the flexibility that comes out of our lessons from the pandemic is also a big theme in this. So to explore the employer's role, we now have Carrie Hannon, and I very much appreciate it. Thank you, Carrie. The floor is yours.
Oh, Caitlin, thank you. It is a pleasure to be with all of you, and such an important topic. Today, we've got this incredible panel of experts, and we're just to quickly introduce who you're going to be hearing from today. We've got Joseph Fuller, Joe Fuller, who's Harvard Business School's co-director of the project on managing the future of work. Catherine Collinson, who is the CEO of Transamerica Center for Retirement Studies and Transamerica Institute, and Claudia Fine from eFamily Care. Now, what we're looking at today is something that is impacting every employee. It's not whether you're old or whether you're young. Caregiving is just a huge issue for all of us coming out of the pandemic. Particularly employers, I think, got a bit more sensitive to this, but we're really at a pivot point of what benefits are available. Workers feel that they're, embarrassed to even discuss a lot of these caregiving issues because of fear of being passed over for promotions. They feel they've had to step out of the workplace in order to do this duty that they have, that they feel emotional about, strongly about. So let's turn to our experts and kind of get a look at from three perspectives: from the employer perspective, the employee perspective, and then what are some of the solutions that we're seeing starting to bubble up and that really we're hoping to get some teeth in some of these benefits. So I'm going to kick off now with Catherine. Catherine, can you tell us, from your perspective, what the studies, the research you all have done is, what are the big challenges for employees looking at this?
Okay, well, let's just start with some numbers. And we do an annual survey, and our most recently published survey that we put out just a week ago, it's a broader life and retirement survey. And we see that almost 4 in 10 workers, employed workers, are either currently serving as a caregiver or have served as a caregiver in the past. And that's about 38%. And to your point earlier is this is not an older worker or a younger worker or specific demographic. It's an everybody situation. And in fact, looking across generations, millennials in this iteration of the survey are the generation most likely to either be serving as caregivers or served as caregivers in the past at 42%. I also want to point out, though, that 35% of the Gen Z workers in the survey, and our surveys age 18 and older, 35% of Gen Z indicated that they have been or either currently caregivers or caregivers in the past. And then we see similar findings among boomers and Gen X. Some of the differences are who they're caring for. And another thing that we see is across the board, about 8 out of 10 are making some sort of adjustment to their work situation as a result of becoming a caregiver. They're still employed because this is a survey of employed workers, but many indicate that they've either missed days of work, some have taken a leave of absence. Some say they had quit a job altogether. So these decisions as caregivers, they're doing some invaluable work, a labor of love, but it could be at the risk of their own careers, earning powers, and ability to save for their own retirement. So there are hidden costs to this that could be difficult to recover from financially.
Joe, can you give us a sort of an insight into what you found in terms of what the employers are thinking in this regard? What's happening there?
Well, as you suggested, Carrie, at the beginning of the session, a lot of employers are now revisiting the subject in the aftermath of COVID. And but before COVID and even today, I think employers generally have a pretty narrow view on caregiving. My research indicates that they greatly underestimate the impact of caregiving on both turnover and presenteeism, which some of you will know means that you show up at work, but you're so distracted you're not being productive. And for example, in my research, only about 25% of employers thought that caregiving impacted the productivity of their workforce, which was pretty amusing because 80% of workers said that it affected their productivity some of the time, most of the time, or all of the time. Also, companies tend to get very focused on kids and specifically infants. And part of that is because they know when they have health claims for a pregnancy or delivery. But the many myriad types of caregiving that people engage with over the breadth of their lives, particularly oriented towards seniors, is invisible to a lot of employers. Now, COVID has given a lot of employers, at least for their white collar workers that work remotely, literally given supervisors almost a live window into people's homes. So whether it's as trivial as, oh, Joe's a dog owner, which is I am, and when one of my rather large dogs crawls in my lap when I'm on a video conference, I can't deny that I've got a 90-pound pointer looking into the camera. Having said that, I think currently all bets are off because at least it relates to white collar. And let's remember, only about a third of work in the United States can be done hybrid or fully remotely. So that's a minority of workers. It's maybe a majority of the people on the call or in this session or their friends, but it's a distinct minority of workers. So employers are beginning to ask, well, what are we going to need to accommodate now? But while there is some innovation, which we can talk about in benefits and technology, it's still early innings.
Joe, thank you so much. And I appreciate you bringing up the disparity of the different kinds of workers out there. I think that's really important point that we all need to consider when we write these kinds of stories as well, is realize that there are just these different segments of the population that are grappling with this. Claudia, your company is a startup in this arena. What have been some of your challenges in terms of finding what's going to work? You know, what kinds of benefits employers are seeking?
Well, I think that, technology is really just beginning to it's apparent that this can help. We found in our experience that a lot of the employers and employees, don't really effectively use, their burgs or their support groups that the employers have created for them. One, because it means that they have to take time from their work, which they don't have time for anyway, because they're having to call about the caregiver. Very sorry. And they are not interested in devoting time to dealing with caregiving on someone else's schedule. So technology has really been helpful in that area, making something available. The other thing that we found is that, employers are often not trustful of their employers in terms of helping. It's like, who is this? Are you doing this for me because I have a problem, or are you doing this because you want to make sure that you can get the most out of me, and if you can't, I should go elsewhere, or I should do something else? So I think that there's a real need to separate out, support for caregiving from other kinds of employee support programs.
Terrific. Catherine, we're going to jump back to you to drill down a bit. I know personally I was caregiving for my 92-year-old mom during the pandemic. Luckily, at the time, I was running my own business. So guess what? I had flexibility. I could get up at 4 a.m. and get going get a lot done before mom got rolling. But what are you hearing employees, any specific things that they're seeking that they've actually already been able to land with their employer that has made this caregiving challenge a little more palatable?
Well, a couple of things that we're seeing in our research, and it echoes what we've heard. For white collar jobs that went remote during the pandemic, with flexible work arrangements and such, has made it much easier for people to be caregivers and stay in the workforce. And then to reiterate, people who physically had to go to work or do have to go to work tend to be less flexible schedules. And then, of course, during COVID, there was the risk of exposure and bringing it back home, which also is a really big deal. One of the things that we see among employers, because we do an employer survey, in some encouraging news that employers are, it's not a household or employment space conversation daily, but employers are tuning into the issue because caregiving is an everybody issue. It affects the company's leadership with their own families being in the situation, as well as their workforce. So the heightened awareness is really improving, and we are starting to see employers do more for their caregiving employees. In terms of certain types of benefit, the flexible work arrangements I mentioned, but also some are offering employee assistance programs, referral to backup care. One thing in our employer survey that I'd love to see grow, because it's only 21% of employers, offering training for managers on how to recognize, understand, help foster and address caregiving situations in the workplace, to have an empathetic, compassionate company culture.
Oh, I love that, Catherine, because that, I think, opens the door to make it easier for someone to have that conversation with their manager. You're not that empathy word really rings true here. Joe, how about what are you seeing, any specifics from the employers you've studied?
I think there are several things that I'd like to point out. Some that were underway prior to COVID, but COVID just kind of generally, Carrie, what COVID did was accelerate a number of different trends that were already visible in the workforce, but it just slammed on the accelerator, was everything from more remote work to more focus on these issues. I think we're beginning to see some real innovations in benefits. And an example of a company that I think is a pioneer in that is called Wellthy, WELLTHY. I admit that, and the name makes you think it's a retirement savings vehicle or something like that, IRA match fund. What they do is essentially provide a caseworker that will deal with complex care and particularly healthcare situations for the members of a family of an employee. What they have demonstrated to their large number of corporate customers now, over 100, and these are very large companies, is that by putting an expert caseworker on the scene, they greatly enhance the quality of life and the ability of their workers to be productive and reduce turnover. They've had a great success in part because so many decision makers in companies have lived through a situation like this. They're a C-suite executive in Chicago. Their parents are living in Arizona or Florida. They get a call from their mother or father that one of them has got a scary diagnosis. They know that distracted them, and Wealthy can say, not only do we have case officers that can help, we've got people who specialize in cognitive conditions in Florida and knows all the clinicians. And by the way, we will be able to quickly understand what the health care benefit that your parents have, how it applies, and things like that. Another example that I think is very interesting, and this is more blue collar oriented because Wealthy is oriented toward white collar companies, is more companies are creating shared resources to help lower wage workers with things that happen in their lives that disrupt their ability to work. Great example of this is Western Michigan, a consortium called The Source. And what The Source does is literally hire local employers have bonded together, people like Butterball and the office furniture companies in that part of the state have banded together to hire, I think it's more than one professional now, who their workers call up if they've got a teen in trouble, if they've got someone with a substance abuse problem in their household, even if they've got problems not care related, but transportation problems getting to work. And what those case officers know about is all the different resources in that locale. It could be a not-for-profit, it could be a state benefit, but what you consistently find, whether it's the Wealthy business model or consortia like The Source, is one of the big drivers here is people can't navigate the system. The system is very complicated, and I think companies that in the future are going to try to intervene in those pinch points and have resources available to people at least in those kind of moments of crisis to intervene. One last thing that I just want to mention is most employers are just beginning to understand how much particularly turnover, voluntary departures from work really cost them. And that finally gives us a basis for understanding what the return is on the investment in caregiving benefits. Historically, caregiving benefits, it's just been a cost. And employers generally weren't kind of crediting that they got something back for that. And so, of course, they invested in things like, employee assistance programs, which are very low cost and very low impact. But now that they're saying there's a clear line of sight between important people in my organization leaving because they do have, a child with health problems, or they do have parents they have to take care of, or they're in that dreaded sandwich generation that got it on both sides. That is a true cost to my enterprise. I will invest in reducing that cost.
Yeah, that is awesome. And Joe, thanks for mentioning Wealthy. I wrote about them in my latest book, In Control at 50 Plus. They're doing, it's an interesting model, and Claudia's as well. We're going to skip right to that in a second, but I do think it's important to make the business case for providing these kind of benefits. That, just like you said, that's going to turn the corner on this when they realize the ability to retain workers and the cost of turnover. That's enormous. The other two things that come to mind, maybe we'll get into this more, is, substantial paid leave that would go to help people who do have to step out, as well as care subsidies. And Claudia, can you jump in and give us some ideas of what your company is doing?
Well, actually, thanks, Joe, for teeing me up. That what Wealthy does is, it's not a new concept. Pinnacle did that before. There have been many companies that have supported as white collar workers to help them navigate and manage their health care and whatnot. I think eFamily is somewhat like Wealthy, but the difference is that it can basically be more for, you know, really employees like home health aides, you know, really working class people who may not need that ongoing support, but need to have a connection to someone, because caregiving is not a unique one time and you're done situation. But so what we do is we have, first of all, it's pretty cost effective because it's digital. And that digital app is on somebody's browser or on someone's telephone. There is a dedicated, we call it a care advisor, that helps navigate resources, helps problem solve certain situations, helps also identify and link the employee with what already exists in the company. Because very often employees are frightened or don't know how to talk to their supervisors about what's going on. So if we can help with them with language, they can, in the same way that you want to train, you know, managers to be able to talk to employees, employees need to be able to know what's available and feel comfortable being able to reach out and access some of the benefits that they have. You know, we've had, you know, in a large healthcare system, we've had people who were going to retire or resign from potentially big positions because they felt that they would, you know, somehow have less, you know, that they would be castigated in some way for taking time off, not using their family leave, etc. So, you know, I think that, you know, this kind of model of being able to advise, but also in real time when needed, like our employees get access to help every 2 hours, within 2 hours, they just go on a phone, send a message, and someone comes back, a dedicated person comes back to them with some kind of response and help.
Claudia, how do the fees work? How does eFamily get paid?
Well, we have, you know, usually the employer pays per worker, for utilization, for access, for engagement. We do have a model. It's a consumer-driven model that somebody can like just sign on themselves. But mostly in corporations, hospital systems, health plans contract with us to target those employees or workers or members or patients that they are concerned about and whose caregivers.
Is there a ballpark figure for what they would pay per employee, or what if I as an individual signed up?
It's ballpark figure. If you as an individual signed up, it would be $50 a month.
Gotcha.
I think it depends upon all the bells and whistles.
Yeah.
You know what it would be per month, but it's in the ballpark of user per month situation, like any EAP type program.
Sure, and the more employees you have, the less it'll be for the employer. I get that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So we've got like 5 minutes here. I want to just go, before we go to all these great questions from our fellows, I would just some big picture thinking. Catherine, can you just tee us up here just a little bit about why does this matter? What is the impact on the future of work for this particular issue, and what's your sort of high thinking on this?
This is everybody's issue and everybody's opportunity. And we're at a moment in our history with the pandemic that we're fully understanding caregiving and the impacts of caregiving on the workforce. We've talked a lot about employees and direct employee impact, having to make adjustments to their work that could impact their future earning and ability to save for their own retirement and future care. We've talked about the impact on employers directly as it relates to the caregiver and cost of employee retention. Another big aspect of it, though, is a company culture that we haven't touched on. And a company culture that's a caring culture impacts all of the workers. And I know many people, including myself, who have been caregiving and working and having supportive employer, but as well as a corporate culture where employees look out after each other or can help each other out on a bad day, or just the art of being there can make a huge difference. And as we look forward to the future, and it's so exciting that we're seeing all this innovation, as we look forward to the future, we know that this is going to become an even bigger issue with the aging of the population, as well as the high cost of long-term care services and supports. This is something that we can all work together and do something really extraordinary and incredible for humanity, as well as solve a problem.
I love that. The art of being there. I love that. Joe, what's sort of from the high level here? What do you see as the impact on the future of work here?
Well, one thing that's undeniable about the current situation in the United States is that the demographics of the workforce are changing in several different dimensions. One is the rate of workforce growth is stagnating. So unlike our peer competitors in Europe and North Asia, which will have negative workforce growth, we have basically flat workforce growth, which is a huge advantage relative to those peers. A lot of people don't realize that half of economic growth in most developed economies is explained simply by more people working. So if you thought that a good year in the economy was 3% GDP growth, that was half because the workforce grew and half because of productivity growth. Well, we need to keep more people in the workforce and in ways that allow them to be more productive. So that means give people support so they don't leave the workforce when they would like to continue working and they're still able to, but they are obliged to leave because of a caregiving obligation, which is a material number of people. The second is to ensure that people who are employed can be productive. Now, as Claudia said, that can be viewed as a cynical move by the employer, but if you're relieving worrisome episodes from people's lives, if you're giving people help with what are often highly technical problems, what does that insurance cover? How do you find a clinician for that type of condition? What are the 3 or 4 programs in your region that are effective with a health problem, with a behavioral health problem, a mental health problem, an addiction problem, and start making that easier to navigate and done by with support, then you get some of the benefits that Catherine was speaking to. I do want to say that I believe we're getting an era where this is going to become a basis for competition between companies, and that's a good thing, and that we're going to get more gradations in terms of benefits packages. I don't actually like the word benefits particularly because it sounds like it's something other than part of the terms and conditions of employment. It's bestowed on you by your employer. But one of the big barriers to more aggressive adoption of caregiving benefits is that companies have historically viewed benefits as a one-size-fits-all, titrated by where you are in the organization. So maybe if you're a vice president or above, you get some extra bennies, but basically, other than that, everyone gets everything. And that's why you get these elephantine cafeteria plans. I think we'll move eventually to more segmented offers. We're going to recognize that at different stages of life, people would have different needs and need different things from their employers. And that this kind of dilemma of, gosh, if I do that, I have to offer it to everyone, that may recede, and we're going to say that we're going to have the platinum package, the gold package, the silver, the blue package, and it's going to be based on, if you're a young family, you're not going to make use of 50 things in the cafeteria plan, which your senior workers will be using. Yeah. And one of the big things we have to do as a country is get people to work longer. And why is that's not slave labor? It's
No.
because their health outcomes are better, their ability to stay in their own homes is better, they're much less likely to make the catastrophic decision of activating the Social Security earlier, and any kind of artificial barrier to work or manageable barrier to work by people who are getting close to retirement age is something we should have a societal goal to stop, to remove, because it's in everyone's best interest. That individual, the Treasury of the United States, the employers of the United States, the communities of the United States.
Yep. It makes us much more nimble. I can see that. And Claudia, just before we jump into our Q&A with the fellows, can you just share a couple of your big picture thoughts?
Well, I think that, stress is an enormous issue in caregiving. And I think that some of these plans and the approach to this really needs to be focused on the stress of the caregiver. So having the ability to not just have a resource, but to have someone basically there or something there that helps contain or work with that stress will enable the employee to manage their work time. They won't be, checked out, as Joe mentioned, on the job. They'll be more functional, they'll be more productive. And so one of the things that we do is really measure that with our users. We want to see how is it going for you, sort of thing. And then we can sort of drill down and find out what are the factors in creating the stress. And then we can identify a problem, and then we can solve for the problem by identifying the resource. So really using employee stress as a way to, find out and identify needs and prevent people from checking out of work, retiring prematurely, feeling like they can no longer keep it going. The other thing is that, being more creative in jobs is helpful. Employers being able to, work on job shares and putting people together in similar situations that would extend people's ability to stay in the workforce when they're in a caregiving situation. And I don't think we've really thought about or talked about that enough.
Claudia, thank you. I appreciate that. I think those are some great insights. All right, guys, it's time for the dance. Let's hear a show of hands, some questions to see where you want to lead the discussion. Carlos, I think your hand has been up. Do you want to launch off here?
Hey, yeah, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks again for taking the time to be with us. This has been very, very informative. I have a couple questions, and I'll start with the kind of the broader one, which is, I'm a little skeptical that employers will be able to give or provide their employees with this kind of leniency to care for their older adults and their families. Isn't it worthwhile to pursue policy either at the state level or at the federal level that mandates these sort of benefits? I know benefits is not the right word, but some sort of policy level solution that prevents employers from even thinking about not providing this time for caregiving. That's one thing. And the second thing, quickly, is how should employees who work in low wage industries and who are screwed over on a daily basis, what are the solutions for those people in those sectors, particularly as they get older as well and will need to start caregiving more frequently as well? Thank you.
Thanks, Carlos. Who wants to jump on? Let's start with the policy one. Any thoughts, Joe? Do you have any thoughts on that, or?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very tantalizing proposition that we're going to insist that employers do certain things, and certainly in terms of things like having a national paid leave policy, I think there's very strong arguments for that. But we have to be very cautious about uniform changes to employment regulation. And because the systems effect play out over an extended period of time. So I'll give you just a quick example. There are a huge number of companies in France that employ 45 people. Why? Because when you employ 50 or more people, a whole raft of new labor regulations come in. So if you start saying all employers have got to provide even paid family leave, which I'm a supporter of, then what happens to that marginally profitable 8-employee small business where you are now essentially providing the net effect of that policy is to significantly raise a marginal tax rate on the owner operator. Owner operators don't say, I guess I just won't make any money this year, or I guess I'll make as much as my frontline employee. They fire people or they shut down the business. Also, we're in a cycle now where there are a lot of incentives to bring employment back to the United States, or at least back into the North American free trade area. But we know that when you get policies that raise the cost of unit labor, it makes offshoring marginally more relatively attractive. So I'm just saying we have to be really careful about these blunt force things. And I do think workforce trends will make it more compelling for employers to find solutions, and that you'll get innovative startups like Claudia's that are economical ways for companies to respond to the phenomena that a omnibus policy would be seeking to address.
Thank you. Bob Powell, I think you have a question there.
Sure. So in one of our assignments, we watched a video from Dr. Tom, whose research suggested that when women and men begin caregiving, they leave the workforce and in many cases don't return. I'm wondering if you could, one, address that. And then secondly, for Catherine, in your research of employers, did you find nuances between large, medium, and small-sized employers?
Okay, I think maybe was the first question for me?
Jump ball.
Catherine,
well, that kind of career break phenomena is particularly profound for women, and just as there are emerging solutions to caregiving obligations, there are solutions to second order effects of caregiving, like someone who left the workforce, as my wife did, to raise our 3 sons and then re-entered the workforce. This is another thing that smart companies are beginning to focus on, that you have someone with a technical background, with a degree, that is now suddenly available. So for example, GM has a program for women engineering graduates who took a career break and allows them to come back for 6 months, and they have about a 50% yield. A bunch of the people that enter that program do say, you know, this really isn't for me anymore, but they're doing it because they need engineers. And the market phenomena, whether it's in care, career reentry, engaging marginalized communities of potential workers in the United States, all of those things are being looked into now more and more by employers, simply because they have to find additional workers who can be productive, and they want to retain the ones they have, which means they have a strong incentive to start revisiting why people leave, which brings us back to care.
Catherine, what's your research show in that area?
Okay, we'll go to the employer research, but I just wanted to comment, and this is based on my own personal caregiving experience, and it relates to timing risk. And when I was a caregiver, my duties started in 2003, and not thought to last. I was under tremendous pressure to take a leave of absence or quit my job from my family. And the thought process was it was only going to be a few months. Well, it turned into 5 years. And my duties ended in September of 2008. What would have been the likelihood for a 40-something-year-old woman who had been out of the workforce for 5 years to find a job at the height of the Great Recession?
Zero.
It would have been impossible. Thankfully, I had my employer was supportive and flexible. It did put my career on a whole different trajectory. But when we think about people taking time out of the workforce, one thing about caregiving, we don't know how long the duties are going to last, and months could turn into years. And the world of work is changing so quickly, especially for people who are not fresh out of college. Of course, caregiving it's the hardest job in the world. We also have to acknowledge that it is just so extraordinarily difficult to jump back in. To Bob's question, do we see things in our research by company size? And the answer is yes. Medium and large size companies, medium we define as 100 to 499 and large is 500 plus, are more likely to be offering services and supports as part of their business practices and benefit programs for their employees related to caregiving. Small business, like we see in so many other aspects of compensation and benefits, are lagging behind, but may also be doing things on a more informal basis. But even among medium and large companies, there's a lot more that they could be doing to support their caregiving employees.
Betsy, do you have a question? I thought I saw your hand up there.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all for this discussion. It's really, really interesting. I had a couple of questions for any of you. One is, to what extent do you think, or does the research show that caregiving responsibilities actually are a reason for people not returning to the workforce right now, given the incredible difficulties in the past year or two getting, the companies are having hiring people? And the second question is, to what extent do you think employers are recognizing and starting to address the highly unpredictable nature of caring for older people, given that it's so different from programs that help people, with childcare? I mean, as you know, you can have a big meeting tomorrow morning, and tomorrow morning, mom or dad collapses, and then what do you do? And so I'm just wondering what kind of thinking or policies or anything that employers are doing to address that, to the extent that they recognize it.
Claudia, do you have any
Yeah,
thoughts?
yeah. Just from our experience working, in the few markets that we have, I think internal education is, people who are interested in looking at ways to support employees with caregiving are also looking at ways to educate employees about the nature of caregiving. And so I think what needs to go hand in hand is, managers, leaders in corporations understanding that this is the new reality, that, we've heard the numbers, percentages of our workforce that are going to basically be impacted by caregiving situations. And so a lot of these meetings are going to be, disrupted in some ways. And so there has to be different solutions. So having stand-ins, using virtual meetings is clearly what we do now, because it's a lot easier to pick mom off the floor and then get on your computer. Frequently I've been on Zoom calls on my iPhone when I have to go somewhere. So, using technology, letting, leaders understand that they have to be more flexible, that it's a different world. And so that's what we're seeing with people who want to use our services. They're simultaneously trying to educate, their leadership.
Joe, did you want to weigh in on that?
Well, let me a couple of things. I think what Claudia said is very important, and of course, one of the things getting smarter about caregiving and particularly for seniors is to be more anticipatory in your moves and not find yourself when you've got a serious situation because you didn't know that it'd be wise to get someone to come in and spend an hour in your parents' home and suggest modifications in the layout and whatnot, so there were fewer tripping risks and things like that. I want to come to the first part of the question though, which is actually part of a very profound issue in the United States, which has to do with the workforce participation rate. The workforce, if I just urge all of you to pay much more attention to that number. The workforce participation rate in the United States has been falling for men and women since the early 2000s. It's now lower than virtually all of our peer competitors in the world. And very often a punchline by Americans is, well, no one really works in France. Well, France has a higher workforce participation rate than we do. That wasn't the case 25 years ago. And there are a lot of drivers of that. But a big driver is early retirement. And the biggest driver of the so-called Great Resignation, which actually wasn't so great and was an absolute continuation of a trend that was already visible in the economy, was a 1.9% jump in the retirement rate. And that had to do with the asymmetric risk associated with COVID to older people, but it also has to do with everything from, I think people during COVID felt pretty good about their IRAs and the equity value of their homes if they owned a home and whatnot. I hope we can feel good about the value of our IRAs again sometime soon, but that there are a lot of barriers to wanting to stay at work. And I think innovative companies over time, this will also speak to the second part of the question, are just going to start changing and broadening their definitions of work. I think that there aren't going to be, you work here full time or you work here part time or you work for somebody else or you're unemployed or retired. There are going to be things like for white collar older workers, I think you're going to see seasonal work. And I don't mean picking strawberries. I mean that everyone knows part of your deal, if you will, is that you're going to your summer home on Memorial Day and you're going to be back on Labor Day and you're available one morning a week and that's it. And rather than all your co-workers saying, oh gosh, why does Joe get that great deal and I have to fly? They've got their deal. Their deal may be that they don't have to show up on school days to work till 10 o'clock and they get to leave at 5 because they're going to do school drop off and their spouse or partner is going to do school pickup. So that we'll have much more customization that will help enhance workforce participation. But having said that, the workforce participation rate in the United States is a very scary thing right now. And particularly in prime working age males, and is indicative of other problems in the economy and society that we have to get serious about.
Thanks, Joe. Liza, I see your hand's been up for a while. What do you got for us?
Oh, yeah. So I was just wondering if you have any data or insights into what long-term companies are doing to help in this area, specifically home care.
Anyone?
What do you mean? You mean long-term care insurance?
No, I mean like long-term care facilities, senior living, nursing homes. I work in the home care home care media space for people who own home care companies. So I'm just wondering if you have any data on that, like, because we learned from the last session that a lot of the employees who are doing work for older people then have their own caregiving responsibility. So I'm just wondering if companies in this area have tuned into this at all that you know of.
Funny you should mention that. We just started a contract supporting professional caregivers with a home care agency. And what we're finding is that much of the support, we went in thinking that we were going to extend their training and ability to navigate the challenges of being in a home and caring for a complex patient when frequently the support they get is one nursing supervision a month. What am I talking about? Once every 6 months in New York. And what we found is that much of what our care advisor and the app is used for is for themselves. That, you know, they really need to, they're asking for where they can get benefits and where they can find, you know, food supplements and what types of transportation options are that do they have, or what happens if, you know, somebody turns off their electricity and they can't come to work, or they have no gas for their car. So we're ending up supporting them so that they can support the patient in the home. It's a very small pilot at this point, and you know, the question will be, will we see any, you know, ROI on it, and you know, whether how the margins in home care, as you know, are non-existent. So it's really a challenge, but we're trying.
And that's with the eFamily?
Yes.
Okay.
Nina, you have your hand up?
Yes. Yes, I was just curious. We've talked a lot about what businesses need to take on to help people deal with caregiver issues and the toll it takes on the workforce. So many other countries have this dialed in so much better because of centralized medicine. And I'm just wondering, are you, Catherine, maybe you can speak to this, any pushback from businesses finally saying, you know, we're done adding more services and care. We keep putting more and more on the employers. I'm surprised there's not a pushback that they're pushing for more federal centralized healthcare or larger programs. Obviously it would cost more in taxes, but it seems like my husband has a small business and he's just, it's really hard.
That's a really interesting question. And in our most recent employer survey, we saw a couple of things, and I don't know that it's pushback per se. Employers are very tuned in to attracting and retaining talent and their workers. And what we did see is a high percentage of employers saying they're reevaluating their benefits offerings in some ways to be more aligned with their workforce needs. But there's also a reality that they're looking to manage costs as well. And again, we saw the trend, larger companies being more likely to do so than smaller companies. So the trend that I would put in my words is looking to further optimize their offerings.
Francis, you had a question.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm curious about how all of this that you've been discussing impacts immigrants and communities of color, because sometimes, you know, because there's like, you know, the generic solution, and I know generic is the wrong word, what can help, like a family that has specific language and food and cultural needs. You need someone who speaks the language, who understands the culture. And also, how does this affect small family-owned businesses, where we're not talking about, I mean, I know that definition goes up to 50 people, but what if the family is just, you know, literally mom and pop?
Who wants to jump in on that? Joe, you have any thoughts?
Could you restate the question? I was trying to answer a question in the chat.
I'm sorry.
That's what I get for multitasking.
I just kind of want some broad thoughts, because I don't feel it. How do these trends affect? Okay, so two questions. One is, you know, when I know you're saying one size doesn't fit all, but for immigrant communities, one size really doesn't fit all, right? It needs to be very specific in terms of language and cultural needs.
Yes.
But then also, second question is about small family-owned.
Right.
What can they do?
Yeah.
When they're really small.
Well, you know, small businesses are deeply constrained. The good news in small businesses is that in small businesses, everyone knows each other. And where you really see the biggest problems are actually in big employers, because in big employers are hamstrung by policies, and policies are deliberately set up to prevent supervisors or coworkers from unleashing exceptions that then start undermining the legitimacy of policy. But small businesses don't have a lot of resources unless they're in the hedge fund trading business or something, and they are going to be constrained, and they're going to rely on many more informal mechanisms, like I'll just take your shifts next week, or gee, I hear your mom, an owner operator saying, gee, I hear your mom is sick. Why don't you just take off and get back to me? And I started the business, and at one point it got big eventually, but it was started off small. I made decisions like that all the time. The immigrant community issue is highly complex. Of course, many immigrant communities have other informal mechanisms, such as they live in neighborhoods surrounded by immigrants from their same country. So you can see in Seattle, Vietnamese neighborhoods and barrios around LA that relate to specific Central American countries. But since immigrants so often are in lower wage jobs, their problem compounds very rapidly. If they're in a family group, then of course they have more support mechanisms, since family structures are pretty robust in a lot of immigrant communities. But it's and often they're community organizations that support them. So, but those are among we shouldn't be worried about JP Morgan Chase bankers or McKinsey consultants and who's going to worry about their caregiving obligations. I know they do. Everyone's got challenges, but their employers are going to take care of them. It's the populations you're talking about that have to rely on personal networks and informal mechanisms now. And in some ways, we want to be careful about not having rules or regulations that ends up somehow abolishing those or making those legally problematic, just as we also want to think about more solutions that provide people more access to services, those who are least able to afford their access it today.
Thank you, Joe. That's great. And here's our last question coming from Pamela.
Hi, thanks so much. So I guess I have two questions. I don't want to say that they're quick, but I'll try and make them quick. The questions are for everyone, but Professor Fuller might want to take a step, because I'm building off some of the past questions, just with a focus on special populations. So like in the case of an individual who's low income, they don't have a college degree, and then they did take some time away from the workforce, because of caregiving or other issues. Like you mentioned, the individual, I don't know, it was a mom who trained as an engineer and then applied to this returnship program. But what about individuals who don't have, the engineering degree? What about, individuals who might not have access to that? Like, what do you recommend? I mean, do you think that they should, go back to college in their 50s and 60s? Is that something that employers would look favorably towards? I mean, just have a lot of questions about this whole topic.
All right, well, let's just jump on one of those. Who wants to, Catherine, you have thoughts there, or Joe?
Well, that's a hugely broad question. I'm going to say something that's going to sound very self-serving. I think if you go to if you Google Harvard Business School Managing the Future of Work project, you'll land on our website, and there are a lot of approachable resources. They're not academic papers there that would touch on some of those issues. But for people who are entering the workforce for the first time, the two most important things they can do is actually understand what jobs are available where they live, as opposed to just go and start studying something, and try to find some mechanism to get exposed to that work so they can validate their hypothesis that it might be interesting to them is true. And then looking at the job requirement or talking to the employer, figure out what kind of qualifications that are accessible to them would qualify them for active consideration to get hired. That's a very fast answer, but
Well, that's what we needed, Joe, because we're down to time. So
okay.
I want to thank everyone. The panelists, you were awesome. I didn't expect anything less than that. And fellows, thanks for chiming in with great questions. I know there were probably a lot more we couldn't get to, but I certainly love the passion that's on this subject, and it's so critical. Caitlin, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Thank you. And thank you for your excellent job moderating, Carrie. I just wonder if fellows might think about a very particular angle of today's second panel, and that's how all these workplace issues affect employees' healthy aging. It's a significant aspect of the academy to consider longevity's effect on the future longevity of the next generation. So are we significantly costing health futures and financial futures? So I'd love to see stories come out of this along those lines, and I hope that there are a lot of stories popping in your mind today after these two terrific sessions. I really want to thank everyone: Catherine Collinson, Claudia Fine, Joseph Fuller, Carrie, fabulous job, and then the prior panel: Jennifer Olson, Martin Picard, Sharia Robinson Lane, and Julia Yarbo, also a terrific panel. So it's a wrap for day 3. We'll see you tomorrow, same place, same time. Very important, please make sure to stay at the end of tomorrow's session, and so you can make your Ask Me Anything interview selections. And I'm going to stay here if there are any other questions. And if anyone wants to break out just to chat with other fellows, and I know it's been a long morning, but feel free to raise your hand and we will open breakout rooms. So see you tomorrow, 11 a.m. Eastern. Thanks very much to everyone.